New Mexico Territory, winter of 1884. You paid for a wife, not a servant. Her voice cut through the ranch house like a blade, sharper than the sleet hammering the windows. Every man in the room went still. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes never dropped. The man across from her, tall, scarred, carrying 6 years of guilt behind those dark eyes, held her gaze. Then slowly he stood. You're right. Nobody breathed. This is the story of a woman who arrived as a purchased bride, a man who buried a secret that could destroy them both, and a pair of dark red braided reins hiding a code that would either save 7 lives or end theirs. Stay with me. You'll want to see how this ends. The sleet came sideways, and the stage horses did not want to keep walking. Marin Bellamy pressed her palm against the window glass and watched the road disappear under gray water. Somewhere behind that water was Iron Spur Ranch. Somewhere behind that water was the man she'd promised to marry. The wheels dropped into a rut hard enough to knock her forward. She caught herself on the seat, one hand still locked around the handle of her trunk. The leather there was cut nearly through, a clean slice someone had tried to hide by folding the strap over. She'd noticed it in Santa Fe and hadn't said a word to anyone about it since. By the time the driver called out that they'd gone as far as the mud would let them, her dress was soaked through to the shoulders. She walked the last half-mile on foot, boots sinking, trunk banging against her knee, and when the ranch buildings finally rose out of the sleet, she almost laughed. Almost. A group of men stood under the stable overhang, watching her come. You'd be Rusk's bride, one of them said. He wasn't unkind about it. Just plain, the way men out here tended to be plain about everything. I'm Marin Bellamy, Deke Mallory. I run things when Calder's not around. He looked at the trunk, then at her face, like he was doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. He wasn't looking for you till spring. That's not what his letters said. Well, Deke shrugged, and the shrug said more than any sentence could have. Kitchen's warm, if you want to wait on him there. She didn't want to wait in the kitchen. She wanted to sit down somewhere dry and remember why she'd crossed half a country for a man she'd never met. But there was nowhere else to go, so she went where he pointed her, and she waited. Calder Rusk came in an hour later, mud to his knees, smelling like wet horse and cold iron. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, the way a man stops when he's walked into the wrong room by mistake. You're early, he said. Your last letter said November. My last letter said I hoped it might be November, if the fences held. He set his hat on the table, slow like he needed the extra seconds. You're not what I pictured. Neither are you. He almost smiled at that. Almost. They sat across from each other at the long kitchen table, while Hester Quinn banked the stove and pretended not to listen. Calder pulled a folded stack of letters from his coat, softened at the creases from being carried too long. Marin had her own stack, tied with string, damp at the edges. Read me the part about your father, Calder said. She found it and read it aloud. Then she watched his face change, because the words coming out of her mouth were not the words on his copy of the same letter. Somewhere between her pen and his hands, sentences had been added. Sentences had been taken away. A woman who loved quiet houses and simple chores had replaced the daughter of a traveling horse doctor who could set a broken leg faster than most men could saddle a horse. They changed mine too, he said quietly, and turned his stack around so she could see. Marin read his letters and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The man on paper had talked about starting over, about wanting a partner who understood ranch work. The man across the table from her was harder to read, careful with his words, guarding something behind his eyes. So we've both been sold a story, she said. Looks that way. Then what happens now? Calder was quiet a long moment. Rain hit the window in gusts. Somewhere out past the porch, a horse called out, restless. I won't marry a stranger, based on lies some agency dressed up to look like courtship, he said finally. That's not fair to you. It's not fair to me either. So you're sending me back. I didn't say that. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. I don't know what I'm saying yet. Deke chose that moment to lean into the doorway, arms crossed, looking between them like he'd already decided how this ended. Storm's not letting up till the next stage comes through. She'll need somewhere to earn her keep till then. His eyes went to Marin. Kitchen. Washhouse. Hester could use the help. Something in Marin went very still. She'd traveled 2,000 miles on the promise of a home. She'd left behind the only work she knew, the only life she understood, on the strength of letters that turned out to belong to someone else. And now a man she'd never spoken to before today was telling her, in front of a room full of strangers, that she'd pay her way through scrub water and dish rags until a stagecoach could carry her off again. Her chair scraped loud against the floor. "You paid for a wife," she said, and her voice didn't shake, though her hands wanted to. "Not a servant." The room went quiet enough to hear the fire settle in the stove. Calder looked at her for a long moment. Not the men behind him. Not Deke, still leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed. Her. "You're right," he said. "I paid your railroad fare. I didn't pay a price for your life." He stood too, slow, like a man choosing every word before he let it out. "You are neither my wife nor my servant unless you freely choose the first, and no honest man would ever ask for the second." Nobody in that kitchen said a word. Deke uncrossed his arms and looked at the floor. One of the younger hands by the stove shifted his weight, and suddenly found something fascinating about his own boots. Before Marin could answer, before she could decide if she believed him, a rider came pounding up through the mud outside, calling Calder's name loud enough to carry through the walls. A man in a good coat and a Voss Western matrimonial pin came through the door a minute later, rain running off his hat, already talking about a travel debt owed, papers to be signed, a woman who belonged back east where the company could collect what she owed them. Calder didn't let him finish. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go." The agent's eyes flicked to Marin, cold and assessing, like he was pricing livestock. "She was followed for a reason, Mr. Rusk. Mr. Voss doesn't forget what's owed him." Nobody had time to answer that, because a shout went up from the stable, sharp and frightened, and one of the hands burst through the door with mud on his knees, saying the black stallion had gone down and wouldn't get back up. Marin was moving, before she thought about it, trunk forgotten, boots slipping on the wet porch boards. She dropped to her knees beside the horse in the straw, ran her hand along his gums, pressed her fingers to the pulse at his jaw, smelled his breath. "This isn't sickness," she said. "Somebody poisoned this feed." Calder crouched across from her, and for the first time since she'd walked into his kitchen, he wasn't looking at her like a stranger. "How many horses ate from that batch?" Marin was already moving down the row, checking eyes, checking gums, counting heads in the dim lantern light. When she came back to him, her face had gone pale under the mud and rain. "6 more," she said. "And if every man on this ranch doesn't do exactly what I tell them in the next hour, you won't have half a herd left come sunrise." The night went on longer than any night Marin could remember, and she'd sat up with sick animals plenty of times in her life. She had the men rig lanterns along the stable aisle, so she could see color in the horses' gums, see how fast their eyes tracked her hand. Charcoal mixed into warm water poured slow down the throat of the first gelding, while 2 hands held his head steady. Mineral oil for the next one. Walking, 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 because a horse that lay down with a belly full of poison might never get back up. "Keep him moving," she told a boy who couldn't have been more than 17. "Doesn't matter if he fights you. Moving is what saves him." By the gray hour before dawn, 4 of the 6 were standing on their own, ears forward, drinking water like they meant it. The 5th was a mare, older, heavier in the body, and she went down twice before Marin got her back up the second time, by sheer stubbornness more than skill. The 6th, the black stallion that had started it all, stood in the corner of his stall, with his head low and his sides heaving, and Marin didn't leave him. Calder found her there past sunrise, slumped against the stall boards, one hand still resting on the stallion's shoulder. "He's going to make it," she said, before he could ask. Just needs the day. You didn't sleep. Neither did you. He almost smiled again. She was starting to recognize that look on him, the one that came right before he decided not to smile after all. They walked out to the ranch house together, not talking, because there wasn't much left in either of them for talk. Hester had coffee on and biscuits, and she took one look at Marin's mud-caked skirt and the state of her hands and set a plate down without asking permission from anyone. Eat, Hester said. Then we'll talk terms. Terms, Marin repeated. You saved 4 horses, and you're working on a 5th and 6th, Calder said, sitting down across from her at the same table where she'd delivered her line the night before. That's not something I'm going to pretend didn't happen. I want to offer you work. A month managing the infirmary wages. Marin set her fork down. If I'm going to work here, she said, it's on my terms, not yours. All right. Wages paid weekly, not held back till the month's out. Find my own room, not the bunkhouse, not a cot in the washhouse. Already spoken for. Hester put in from the stove, not turning around. And if I want to leave, Marin said, I leave. No travel debt, no fare owed, nobody stopping me at the gate. Calder studied her for a moment, not the way the agent had studied her the night before, pricing her like stock, more like he was trying to read something written in a hand he didn't quite know yet. You have my word, he said. None of that gets held over you. I want more than your word. I want it, said Plain, in front of your foreman, so nobody on this ranch decides different. So he said it, Plain, that same afternoon, standing in the yard with Deke and 3 of the hands listening. 1 month. Fair wages, her own room, free to go whenever she chose. Deke's jaw was tight the whole time, but he didn't argue it, not out loud. Later, alone with Calder near the corral, he did have something to say. You don't trust me, he said. Not angry, just plain, the way he seemed to say most things. I don't know you, Marin said. That's a different thing. Fair enough. Hester gave her the upstairs room that evening, the one at the end of the hall, with a window that looked out over the pasture instead of the yard. It was bigger than anything Marin had slept in for years, and when Hester set a fresh quilt on the bed, Marin almost told her it wasn't necessary. She didn't. She'd learned a long time ago that refusing kindness sometimes did more damage than accepting it. Deke didn't like any of it. He said so at supper, quiet but loud enough for Marin to hear from across the room. Rejected bride giving orders to men who've worked horses their whole lives, he said to nobody in particular. That's the world now, I guess. She saved 4 horses that would have been dead by morning, Hester said, not looking up from the stove. You want to argue with that, Deke Mallory? You go right ahead. Deke didn't argue with that. He just ate his supper and didn't look at Marin again that night. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Marin checked every horse in the stable each morning, marked her charts, adjusted feed. She found the source of the poisoning by the second day, a new shipment of feed that had come in only a week before her arrival, molasses-sweetened grain that smelled fine and looked fine, and had killed 1 animal already and nearly taken 6 more. This whole shipment gets isolated, Calder told his men. Nobody feeds from it till we know what's in it. That's near half our winter feed, Deke said. I know what it is. We'll be short by January. I know that too. Calder didn't back down from it, and Marin noticed. She noticed a lot of things about him in those first days, small things. He didn't raise his voice at the men, even when they moved slow. He checked on the stallion himself, twice a day, without being asked. He didn't offer opinions about her medical decisions, even when she could tell he had them. It was on the 3rd evening, coming back from the stable with a lantern in one hand, that she found her trunk open, not forced, not broken, just open. The lock turned, but the lid not quite shut, the way it would look if someone had gone through it carefully and tried to leave it as they found it. She stood over it a long moment before she checked what was missing. One of the 2 braided reins her father had made, dark red leather, coiled tight, was gone. She didn't say anything about it that night. She told herself she needed to think first, needed to understand what it meant before she handed anyone a piece of information she couldn't take back. She lay awake, instead, listening to the wind work at the shutters, turning the missing rain over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. The mare went into labor 2 nights later, weeks before she should have. Marin heard the commotion from her room and was down the stairs and across the yard before she'd properly woken up, boots half-laced, coat thrown over her nightclothes. Calder was already in the stall when she got there. Kneeling in the straw, hands steady but his face pale in the lantern light. "She's early," he said. "Too early. Let me see." Marin knelt beside him and ran her hands over the mare's belly, felt for the shape of the foal, listened to the mare's breathing. "Foal's turned wrong," she said. "We can fix it, but you're going to have to do exactly what I say, and you're going to have to do it now." He didn't argue. That surprised her more than she wanted to admit. She talked him through it, hand over hand at times, guiding him where to press, when to pull, when to wait. The mare screamed once, low and terrible, and then the foal came, wet and trembling, and Marin cleared its airway with her fingers and rubbed its sides with a rag until it took its first shuddering breath. Calder sat back against the stall wall, breathing hard, looking at the foal like he'd never seen anything born before. "We did that," he said. "You did that," Marin said. "I just told you how." They stayed with the mare and foal past midnight, wrapping the foal in an old blanket to keep the cold off, taking turns holding the small, trembling body against their coats to share warmth. Calder held the foal for a long while without saying anything, and Marin watched him do it. And something in the set of his shoulders told her he wasn't just thinking about the horse. "Hester tells me you haven't let anyone into your sister's room in 6 years," she said, careful, because she wasn't sure she had the right to say it at all. Calder went still. "Hester talks too much. Maybe. Doesn't make it wrong." He didn't answer for a while. The foal shifted against his chest, found its footing in the blanket, settled. "Nell wanted to come home," he said finally. "Wrote and told me the man she'd agreed to marry wasn't who she thought. I told her to give it time, told her most marriages take adjusting to." His jaw worked. Her letters stopped not long after that. Marin didn't say anything. She'd learned, working her father's rounds as a girl, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a person in pain was let them keep talking without filling the silence for them. "I've been looking for her 6 years, Calder said. "Never found so much as a trace." The next morning, checking the feed stores with fresh eyes, Marin found what she'd missed the first time. Dried oleander leaves, ground fine, mixed in under the molasses coating on the grain. Someone had wanted it to look like drought sickness, like spoiled feed from a hard summer. It wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. She brought the sample to Calder in the yard, held it out on a scrap of cloth. "This was deliberate," she said. "Somebody wanted your herd sick enough to draw attention. Sick enough that inspectors might think you're running a diseased operation." Calder turned the leaves over with one finger. "Face hard. That would end my Army contract," he said. "End the rail spur agreement, too, most likely. Somebody wants that spur badly enough to poison horses over it." Before Calder could answer, a rider came up the drive, well-dressed, polite in the way of men who were used to people being afraid of them. He introduced himself as representing Voss Continental Freight, offered condolences for the ranch's troubles, and offered replacement feed at a fair price and a small loan against the winter, provided Calder would consider granting Voss access to the private rail spur for a season. Generous offer. Given the circumstances, the man said no. Calder said, "Mr. Rusk, your herd is in trouble. Your feed stores are compromised. This is a difficult season to be proud." I said no. The man left without much more argument, which told Marin something about how confident he was that Calder would come around eventually, or that someone else would make the decision for him. That night, warming the newborn foal by the stove in the infirmary shed, Marin and Calder sat across from each other with little left to say, and no particular hurry to say it. "You could have taken that offer," Marin said. "Would have solved your feed problem." and handed a stranger the keys to everything I've built. Calder shook his head. Some debts aren't worth what they buy you. My father used to say something like that, about a man who wouldn't pay him for treating his herd, then wanted him to treat it again the next season. Marin smiled, small, tired. He kept working anyway, said turning away a sick animal wasn't a lesson worth teaching, even to a bad man. Sounds like he was a better person than most. He worked himself to death for people who never paid him what they owed. Marin said quieter now. I used to think that made him a fool. Now, I think it just made him tired. Calder looked at her for a long moment, the firelight catching the exhaustion in both their faces. You're not a fool either, he said, for staying and doing this. I haven't decided if I'm staying. Not past the month. I know. They sat with that a while, the foals breathing steady, and even between them, until Marin remembered something and got up to check on Nell's old traveling case, still sitting where Hester had left it in the corner of the shed, pulled out during the fire scare, over feed storage, and never put away properly. She ran her hand along the lining out of habit more than purpose, the same way she checked stitching on any old leather and felt something stiff beneath the fabric. She worked her fingers into a small tear in the lining and drew out a scrap of braided leather, dark red, half rotted with age. She knew that stitch pattern. She'd learned it from her father's hands before she'd learned her letters. It was the same coded weave as the missing rein from her trunk. Calder found her still holding the scrap of leather when he came looking for her, wondering why she hadn't come back to the fire. What is that? Marin didn't answer right away. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the raised pattern under her thumb, the same braid she could have tied blind. It's stitched the same way as a rein my father made, she said. The same way as one that went missing from my trunk 3 nights ago. That doesn't tell me what it is. It's code. She looked up at him. My father taught me to hide things in the braiding. Numbers, mostly. Routes. He learned it doing work for men who didn't want their business written down plain where anyone could read it. Calder's face had gone very still, the way it did, when he was working hard not to show what he was thinking. Where did you learn to hide things in leather work for a company like Voss? I worked in his office, before I answered your advertisement. She made herself keep talking, even though every part of her wanted to stop. I copied schedules, passenger lists. After a while, I noticed women coming off those lists who never showed up anywhere else. No new address, no family writing back asking after them. I started keeping my own record of it, hidden the way my father taught me, in case I ever needed proof. You knew this company was dangerous, Calder said low, and you still let them arrange your travel here. I didn't have a better way out. You brought that danger onto my land, onto my herd. I didn't bring it, Marin said, and her voice sharpened now. It followed me because I know something Voss wants back. That's different from bringing it, is it? You knew this agency's name before I ever said it, she shot back. You knew the emblem. You told me so yourself. First night I was here. You let a bride travel through a company you already suspected was connected to your sister's disappearance. And you're going to stand there and tell me I'm the one who brought trouble to your door? Calder didn't have an answer for that. Not right away. The silence between them went on long enough that Marin almost regretted saying it, except she didn't, not really, because it was true and somebody needed to say it out loud. That was when the shouting started outside. Fire the foaling barn. They ran together, Calder ahead, Marin right behind him, and by the time they reached the yard, Flame was already climbing the near wall, orange light throwing long shadows across the mud. 2 mares were trapped inside, screaming, kicking at their stall doors, and the smoke was already thick enough to choke on. Marin didn't think. She pulled her coat up over her mouth and went in low under the smoke, feeling her way along the stalls she knew by heart now from 3 days of tending horses in that same barn. She found the first mare's latch by touch and threw the door wide, slapped the animal's flank to send her running for the open air. The second stall was harder, the mare rearing in panic, and Marin had to talk her down, Low, steady words nobody could have heard over the fire, before the horse would let her close enough to work the latch. She got the door open just as a beam gave way above her. Calder's arm caught her around the waist and hauled her sideways, hard enough to knock the wind from her, and the beam came down where she'd been standing a heartbeat before. They hit the ground together outside the barn, coughing, both of them black with smoke, and Marin looked up to find Calder's face inches from hers, his eyes wide with something that wasn't just fear of the fire. He didn't tell her to stay back. He hadn't told her to stay back the whole time. She noticed that, even through the coughing, even through the ringing in her ears. The barn burned another hour before the men got it under control, and by the time the last ember was smothered, everyone was too tired to talk much. It was Deke who found the second fire, a smaller one, set behind the ranch house near the study window, snuffed out early by the rain that had started up again. But not before someone had clearly been inside going through Calder's desk. Somebody wanted us out here, fighting flame, while they searched the house, Calder said, looking at the broken window latch. They found what they wanted, Marin said quietly. She was thinking of the missing rain again, the way its absence had felt like nothing at the time, and felt like everything now. She sat with Calder afterward at the kitchen table, both of them too tired to sleep, and she finally told him the rest of it. There's a code in the reins, she said. Route markers. Some of them tie to freight numbers. One symbol repeats more than the others. Near the end of the pattern I copied. 2 letters, N period, R period. Calder went white. Nell Rusk, he said. I didn't know it was your sister when I copied it. I swear that to you. I only knew a pattern that repeated, tied to a place called Cinder Wash. Calder sat with that a long moment, his hands flat on the table, like he needed something solid to hold on to. You should have told me the first night, he said finally. You should have told me the first night too, Marin said, about the emblem, about why you really answered that agency's letters. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. I'm not sending you away, Calder said eventually. Not for keeping a secret I was keeping myself. That's not forgiveness. No, he agreed. It isn't. But it's honest, and I figure we owe each other that much now. It was near dawn when Deke came to find them, a roll of bills in his fist, his face gray with something worse than exhaustion. I have to tell you something, he said, and set the money on the table like it burned him to hold it. Voss has been paying me, near a year now, for shipment schedules, timing on the rail spur, when the ranch runs light on hands. He wouldn't look at either of them. My brother's medical bills were eating me alive, Calder. I swear before God I didn't know about women. Didn't know about any of it, beyond feed shipments and freight timing. Calder looked at the money for a long time before he looked at Deke. You're going to tell me everything you gave him, he said. Every date, every route, all of it. I will. Then we'll decide what happens to you. Deke talked most of the night, and what he told them painted a clearer picture than either Marin or Calder wanted. Voss knew the ranch's shipping schedule better than most of the hands did. He knew when the rail spur sat empty, when the herd moved light, when the house went quiet, for supply runs into Dry Creek. He'd been building that knowledge for months, patient, waiting for the right week to use it. There's a shipment coming through, Deke said. 6 days out, near as I can tell from what he's asked me for lately. Wanted to know when the spur would sit open longest. Calder didn't sleep after that. Neither did Marin. By first light, they'd agreed there was only one thing to do, ride for Dry Creek and send word ahead, before Voss's plans got any further along than they already were. The storm caught them on the mountain road before noon. It came down sideways, the kind of early blizzard that turned a familiar road into something you couldn't trust even with your eyes open. The bridge over Cutter's Creek had washed soft at the edges, and Calder's horse balked crossing it, feeling the give in the planks before either rider did. They turned back rather than risk it, found an abandoned way station, half buried in drift, and led the horses inside, just as the wind picked up hard enough to howl through the gaps in the boards. It was there, working to repair a harness strap, gone stiff with ice, that Calder's hand slipped and caught the edge of a broken buckle. The old scar across his palm split open, and by the time Marin got a look at it in the lantern light, his whole hand had swollen tight and red. "You should have said something," she scolded, already digging through her bag for what she needed. "Didn't think it was that bad. It's infected. Probably has been for longer than tonight." She worked while she talked, cleaning the wound, packing it, wrapping it tight enough to hold, but not so tight it would cut off the blood. "How'd you get this scar in the first place?" "Forge accident, years back." He watched her hands move, steady, sure. The same hands that had guided him through the mare's difficult birth. Nell was the one who bandaged it that time, too. Sat up with me half the night telling me I was a fool for grabbing hot iron bare-handed. Was she right? Course she was. Marin tied off the bandage and sat back, and for a while neither of them said anything. The wind working at the walls outside, the lantern throwing soft light across the small space between them. "I should have listened to her," Calder said. "Quiet now, the kind of quiet that only comes out when a person's too tired to keep guarding their words. When she wrote asking to come home, I told her marriage takes adjusting to. Told her to give it time." He looked down at his bandaged hand. "She never wrote again after that. You couldn't have known?" "I should have known. She wasn't a woman who complained without cause." He shook his head. "I've spent 6 years telling myself I did right by her. Telling myself waiting was patience, not carelessness. I don't believe that anymore." Marin reached over and covered his good hand with hers, not saying anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would fix 6 years of guilt in one night. He turned his hand under hers, just enough to hold on, and they stayed like that a long while. The storm outside and the quiet inside, and something passed between them that neither one named out loud. They reached Dry Creek the next afternoon, the storm finally breaking, and found Tomas Ibarra at the telegraph office, comparing stage, manifests against a stack of freight records, with the kind of frown that meant he'd already noticed something wrong before they ever walked in. "Women coming off the passenger lists," he said, spreading the papers for them to see. 3 this month alone. No new address filed, no family writing to ask after them. Same as freight, near as the company records show it. Marin went through the freight manifests with her father's old habit of reading between the lines, matching symbols to what she remembered from the office, matching route numbers to the pattern she'd copied into leather months ago. "Here," she said, pointing to a name that had been changed halfway down a passenger list, initials crossed out, and a new name written over top, N.R. Changed to Nora Reed. "Cinderwash?" Calder said, reading the destination beside it. "She's alive," Marin said, managing station records there. "From the look of these entries, they've had her working their own paperwork for years." Calder sat down hard on the bench outside the telegraph office, like his legs had stopped agreeing to hold him. 6 years, he said. 6 years I thought she was dead. And she's been 40 miles from here, filling out freight slips for the man who took her. "We can't ride in there and pull her out alone," Marin said, already working through it, the same way she'd work through a sick horse's symptoms, piece by piece, careful. "If we go in loud, Voss finds out before we're halfway there. He moves her. Moves everyone. We lose the chance. I want to ride tonight, I know you do. And I understand why. But there's more than Nell in that station, Calder. There's a shipment of 7 women coming through your rail spur in 6 days. And if we go in half-planned and get caught, we don't save anybody. We just confirm to Voss that we know, and he buries every trace of it before anyone else can find it." Calder looked at her for a long moment, jaw tight, every instinct in him clearly pulling toward the mountain road and Cinder Wash and his sister's name. "You're asking me to wait," he said again. "I'm asking you to plan," Marin said. "There's a difference. Even if it doesn't feel like one right now." He didn't answer right away. When he finally nodded, it cost him something visible, some old need to fix things with his own 2 hands finally bending to a plan bigger than himself. "All right," he said. "We plan. But Marin, I want every one of those women out. not just Nell. That was always the plan, she said. You just needed a minute to agree to it. They were still standing outside the telegraph office, working through what came next, when Tomas came out, holding something that stopped them both cold. A shawl, torn and blood-stained at one edge, found caught on the fence behind the office, where someone must have dropped it running. Stitched crudely into the hem, in thread that didn't match the fabric, were 7 words. He knows the bride kept the key. The livestock inspectors arrived before breakfast, 2 of them, with an official letter from the territorial office and the kind of careful politeness that meant somebody with authority had told them to come. Marin was already in the stable when she heard the horses, and she stood in the doorway, watching Calder read the letter with his face, doing that still thing it did when he was working hard, not to show his hand. The letter said an anonymous complaint had been filed. Said the iron spur herd showed signs of contagious illness. Said the ranch's shipping permit was suspended pending laboratory confirmation from Santa Fe, which was a 3-week process on a good road in good weather. We'd like to see the animals, the senior inspector said. Go ahead, Calder said. Marin walked them through the stable herself. She showed them the treatment records she'd been keeping. Dated and detailed, gum color and pulse known twice daily for every horse that had eaten from the contaminated batch. She showed them the isolated feed, still bagged and labeled in the corner of the shed exactly where she'd put it. She explained the difference between contagious illness and deliberate plant poisoning, walked them through the physical markers, what oleander does to a horse's gut versus what distemper does to its respiratory system. These animals were poisoned, she said. Every surviving horse on this property is clean. You are welcome to examine any of them, and I will stand here and answer every question you have. The senior inspector listened, asked 3 good questions, took notes, and then told Calder he was sorry, but without laboratory confirmation, his hands were tied. Rule says suspected illness, permit suspends until cleared, he said. I didn't write the rule. And the anonymous complaint, Calder said. Who filed it? The inspector looked at his boots. I'm not at liberty to say. After they left, Calder stood in the yard a long while. The morning was cold and flat, pale sun doing nothing much for the temperature, and the men moved around him at a careful distance, the way they did when they could read his mood. Then a rider came from the Voss Continental office with a letter, polite and sympathetic, offering to replace the contaminated feed at cost and extend a short-term loan to cover winter shortages, provided Calder would sign a seasonal access agreement for the private rail spur. Calder handed the letter to Marin without a word. She read it and handed it back. He filed the complaint himself, she said. Created the problem so he could offer to solve it. I know. And the access agreement gives him everything he needs to move the women through your spur without your knowledge. I know that too. He sent a reply, back with the rider. 1 word, written plain. By afternoon, 2 of the neighboring feed suppliers had sent their own letters, apologetic but firm, declining to fill Iron Spur's winter order. The messages were careful not to say Voss's name, but the timing spoke clearly enough. That evening, Thomas rode out from Dry Creek with news that the Southern Mountain Road might be passable another week, maybe 2, before the next serious snowfall closed it until spring. He said it the way a person says something when they want you to hear what's underneath the words. Calder heard it. You're saying she should go. I'm saying there's a window, Tomas said carefully. Last southbound stage before the high road closes. 3 days out. Marin stood across the yard from both of them near the gate, listening. Calder crossed to her. He didn't try to manage his expression this time. If you take that stage, he said quietly, Voss follows the evidence. He focuses on recovering what you carried out of his office. And this ranch stops being the target it's been. And the women on that shipment? We'd find another way. 6 days, Calder. The shipment moves in 6 days. You said yourself there's no other way into that spur without someone who knows the codes. You'd be safe. Marin looked at him steadily. You're deciding what safe means for me again. He stopped. I'm not trying, I know what you're trying to do. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was something more tired than sharp. You're trying to protect me by removing me from the situation. And you're telling yourself that's different from control. But I was in that office. I copied those codes. I know those women's routes better than anyone on this property. And if I'm on a stage going south while 7 people get loaded into a freight car on your rail spur, that's a decision I'll carry a long time. Calder didn't answer. Marin turned to Tomas. Does Dry Creek have a telegraph that's working? Yes, ma'am. Then I have a few messages to send before the morning's out. She signed the 1-month employment agreement in front of Deke, and 3 hands that same afternoon, formal, witnessed, dated. Calder's equine specialist, Iron Spur Ranch. It was just paper, and she knew that, but paper had a way of making intentions real, and she wanted her intentions real right now. Then she sat with the list of women scheduled to arrive at 3 nearby stations and wrote coded warnings, careful, routed through Tomas's connections at the telegraph office, enough to disrupt Voss's network at the edges without tipping her hand at the center. While she did that, Calder spent his afternoon talking to 3 small ranchers outside Voss's supply network, men who'd known Iron Spur's horses long enough to trust Marin's medical reputation without meeting her. He came back with enough feed to get through February and a promise of more if the passes stayed open. He didn't tell Marin about the money he'd kept back from his own wages to make it work. Hester told her later, in the kitchen, not as gossip, but as information. He paid his men before himself, Hester said, setting a cup down. Always does when it's tight. Figured you ought to know that about him. Marin sat with it a while before she answered. It doesn't change what's between us, she said. No, Hester agreed, but it tells you who he is. The riders hit before sundown, 6 of them, coming in fast from the eastern pasture, and by the time the hands got to the corrals, it was already too late. The black stallion was gone. The horses scattered through the lower pasture, the best quarter of the remount herd, including 3 animals that bore the Army brand and were essential to Calder's contract renewal in the spring. A rider came back an hour later, alone, carrying the stallion's bloodied halter across his saddle. He passed it to Deke without getting down from his horse and rode back the way he came. The note, tied to the halter, had Voss's name at the bottom and 1 line above it. Marin Bellamy surrenders herself by sunrise, or the herd goes into the mining ravine. Calder read it twice. He folded it once, set it on the fence post, and stood looking at the empty pasture in the evening light. Marin stood beside him and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say yet that wasn't premature. They both knew she wasn't surrendering. They both knew the herd was the point. Question now was what came after knowing that. They argued before sunrise, and it was a real argument. The kind that strips away the careful language people use when they're still trying to be polite to each other. Calder wanted to ride out after Voss's camp before dawn, hit them while it was dark and cold and they weren't expecting it. Get the horses back. That was his plan. 2 sentences worth of plan, which was the problem. That's bait, Marin said, standing in the forge room with a lantern between them. He took the herd to empty this ranch. The minute you ride out after those horses, he has whatever he actually wants, which is free access to this property, your rail connection, and nobody left on the land to stop him. I'm not leaving my horses in a ravine. He's not going to put your horses in a ravine. They're worth too much for that, and Voss doesn't destroy things that have value. He was counting on it when he made that threat. Calder looked at her like he wanted her to be wrong. She wasn't. So we sit here and wait. We sit here and plan. She spread the map she'd borrowed from Tomas across the forge bench. Pearl sent us those directions for a reason. If Nell is scheduled to move before dawn with that shipment, then there's a window tonight where she's accessible, and the camp is focused on the horses. Pearl sent us a blood-stained shawl and a message saying, Voss knows what you carried out of his office, Calder said. That's not reliable intelligence. No, but it's the only intelligence we have, and Pearl's been inside that operation her whole life. She knows the difference between information that gets us killed and information that gets us through. They stood across from each other, and the argument went quiet. The way arguments do when both people have run out of reasons to keep disagreeing and have to sit with the actual truth of what they're afraid of. Calder pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. I joined that matrimonial service because of Nell, he said. It came out flat, like a confession he'd rehearsed too many times, and now it just sounded tired. I'd heard through Army contacts that Voss's bureau had placed women with mine owners and camp operators, that the arrangements weren't what they appeared. I thought if I joined as a client, started correspondence, I might get a look at their records, see a name I recognized. Marin didn't say anything yet. Loneliness was part of it too, he said, quieter. I won't pretend otherwise. 6 years alone on this ranch is long enough to want somebody to sit across the table from. But the main reason was Nell. So I was a path into your investigation, Marin said. I crossed the country thinking I was answering a man who wanted a wife, and I was actually answering a man who wanted a lead on a case. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. I'm telling you what it feels like from where I'm standing. Calder met her eyes. You're right, he said. I should have told you the first day. I knew the agency's emblem. I knew what that meant. And I let you stay here, and let you work, and let you come to trust me, and I kept that back. He paused. I'm sorry, Marin. Not sorry in the way where I'm hoping you'll tell me it's fine. Just sorry. The lantern threw long shadows across the forge. Outside, the wind had died down to almost nothing, the kind of quiet that only comes in the deep middle of the night. Marin looked at him for a long time. Then she crossed the space between them and kissed him, because she'd run out of reasons not to, and because some things don't wait for a better moment. They just happen in whatever moment is available. His hand came up to her face, careful, like he wasn't certain she was real, and she let herself stay there, one breath longer than was strictly sensible. Then she stepped back. That doesn't erase it, she said. The deception. I need you to know that, I know, he said. I wasn't going to pretend it did. Good. She turned back to the map. Pearl says Nell will be moved before dawn. Tomas is already in Dry Creek. I'll take Deke with me because he knows the freight camp roads better than anyone, and because he owes us that much. At least you stay and defend this property. I don't want to split up. I know we're going to. Anyway. She looked at him over her shoulder. Give me a good horse and tell me everything Deke told you about the camp layout. He did. He also gave her the best rifle on the property and a box of ammunition, and he didn't argue about any of it, and she knew, watching him help her saddle the horse in the dark, that this was him trying. Not trying to be a hero about it. Just trying to be different than he'd been. Pearl's directions were accurate. Marin could tell that much by the landmarks as they rode, the split rock Tomas had described. The dry creek bed that ran southeast below the freight road. What they didn't know was that Voss had anticipated Pearl's defection. He'd let her send the message. He'd adjusted where he needed to, moved one detail, and left the rest in place. So when Marin and Deke arrived at the freight camp, the outer perimeter was exactly where Pearl had said it would be, and the inner yard was exactly where Pearl had said it would be, and the livestock car standing on the rail siding was exactly where Pearl had said it would be, and Voss was standing at the car door waiting. He didn't look angry. He looked patient, which was worse. 3 men stepped out of the shadows behind Marin and took the rifle before she could clear leather. Deke was pulled from his horse. She didn't fight it, because fighting it here would accomplish nothing, except getting one of them shot. And she needed to stay whole long enough to be useful. Voss took her by the arm, not rough, just firm, the way a man handles something he considers his property. You kept the key, he said. I'd like to discuss what it opens. He locked her inside the livestock car and left a guard on the door. For a moment she just stood in the dark, listening, breathing, letting her eyes adjust. The car smelled of hay and cold iron and old wood. It rocked slightly in the wind. Then, from the dark corner behind her, low and careful, a woman's voice. If you came from Iron Spur, the voice said. Tell my brother Nell Rusk is still alive. Marin turned toward the voice. She couldn't see much, just shapes in the dark. The faint outline of a woman sitting against the far wall, with her knees drawn up and her hands loose in her lap. Posture of someone who had learned a long time ago to save her energy for when it mattered. I came from Iron Spur, Marin said. Your brother's been looking for you 6 years. A long breath from the corner. Then Nell Rusk moved closer, and in the thin light coming through the car's upper slats, Marin got her first look at Calder's sister. Lean, dark-haired, older than her years in the eyes, but steady in the jaw. She looked like someone who had made a decision about survival a long time ago, and had been keeping that decision every day since. Is he all right? Nell asked. He's alive and he's coming, Marin said. That's what I can tell you, for certain. There were 6 other women. In that car, Marin learned their names in the first 10 minutes because knowing names was the first thing her father had always done when he walked into a bad situation. Names made people real. Real people made better decisions together than frightened strangers did. Nell knew everything. That was the thing Marin understood quickly. 6 years of managing records for Voss's remote station had given Nell a memorized map of the entire operation. Names, dates, locations. The number of women moved through each route, the employers waiting at each end. She had no paper. She'd never been allowed paper. But she had it all in her head, recited in the dark of that freight car, like a woman reading from a ledger, only she could see. I've been waiting for someone to come who could actually use it, Nell said. Someone who knew what it connected to. I have the freight codes, Marin said, braided into a rein. If I can match what you remember to what I copied, we have something that holds up. Pearl has the ledger, Nell said, original entries in Voss's own hand. She was supposed to deliver it before tonight. He caught her. Nell was quiet a moment, then we need to get out of this car. Marin had her stitching all in her boot, exactly where she'd put it before she rode out, because her father had taught her to carry a small tool everywhere she went in the world. She worked the awl into the locking pin bracket, while Nell talked quietly to the other women, keeping them steady, keeping them breathing slow instead of fast. It was slow work. Her hands were cold, and the bracket was rusted solid in places. But rust also meant old metal, and old metal worked carefully at the right point. Gives eventually. While she worked, she heard the horses in the neighboring cars, the stolen remounts, shifting and nervous in the confined space. She knew some of those animals by sound now. 3 weeks of daily care had given her that, and she thought about what a horse does when it hears a familiar voice in a frightening place. She whistled. Low, the pattern she'd used in the stable every morning since she arrived at Iron Spur, the same sequence that brought heads over stall doors and ears rotating forward. The horses in the neighboring car went quieter. Listening, Calder. Riding in the dark a mile, behind the freight train with Deacon Hester and 2 of the ranch hands, heard the train moving before he saw it. He'd misjudged the timing by 20 minutes, and those 20 minutes sat on him like stones, because 20 minutes in the wrong direction meant Marin was already inside, and already past the point where his plan did her any good. Deke said, there. The train was moving slow, not yet up to speed, the locomotive pulling hard on the grade. Calder's horse hit the slope at a run and came down toward the rail line, and he was calculating angles and speed and exactly how bad this was going to go when his horse found a patch of ice under the snow and went down. He hit the ground hard enough to see nothing for a moment, just white and ringing, and when his vision came back, Deke was pulling him up by the collar. Get up, Deke said, flat and serious. Get up right now, Calder. I did not ride out here in the middle of the night to carry you home. I'm up, Calder said. He was. His shoulder ached and his pride ached worse, and for one terrible moment he was back 6 years ago, standing at the gate watching Nell's stage go, telling himself he'd made the right call. You're not going to fix this alone, Deke said. You never could. That's what she's been trying to tell you. Calder looked at him. Follow the train, he said. Stop arguing with me. I'm done arguing, Deke said. I'm just telling you the truth while I still have the chance. Inside the car, the locking pin gave. Marin got the door open 3 inches, enough to feel the cold air and see the dark landscape sliding past. And she made a choice based on what she knew about trained horses and what she knew about the terrain ahead. She went to the connecting wall between the freight car and the horse car and found the release lever for the lead mare's gate. She knew which mares they were. She knew what happened when a lead mare stopped, because every horse behind her would slow to match. It was how herd movement worked. It was the principle she'd been using every day in the pasture. She pulled the lever. The 2 mares surged forward into the open section of the car, found the side gate, and she got it open just enough. They went out at a walk, then a trot, then nothing, because a horse dropped onto dark open ground at night doesn't run blind. It slows to figure out where it is. The train lurched as the car weight shifted. The locomotive slowed, the engineer braking hard to compensate, and the whole train groaned and came down to something close to a stop on the grade. Calder was there when the car door opened. He helped the women down, one by one, Nell last, and when Nell put her hand in his, he held it a long moment before he could speak. I'm sorry, he said. I should have listened. You're here now, Nell said. That counts. Marin was already moving, because Pearl was still somewhere on this property, and the ledger was somewhere with Pearl. And without both of those things, what they had was testimony and braided leather, and the word of women Voss would spend every dollar he had discrediting. She found Pearl in the freight office, locked in a back storage room, with the ledger wrapped in her coat, bruised at the cheekbone but upright, which said something about what Pearl Voss was made of under the surface of a woman who'd spent her life pretending to be smaller than she was. Calder pulled her out while Marin took the ledger. Behind them, the freight office caught fire, whether from an overturned lamp in the struggle or from a deliberate hand, nobody would ever say for certain. They ran, all of them, into the cold mountain dark, and Calder made sure he was last through the door. By the time they reached Dry Creek, Voss was already there. The territorial remount auction drew people from 3 counties, which was the only reason Voss chose it. He needed witnesses to his version of events before any other version could take hold. He had Calder at gunpoint on the auction platform when Marin walked into the yard with Nell beside her, Pearl behind her, and 6 other women at her back. The crowd went quiet in that particular way. Crowds go quiet when they realize the show they came to see has turned into something else entirely. Voss recovered fast. He always did. These are the people who poisoned this rancher's horses and stole 7 women from legitimate employment contracts, he announced, loud enough to carry to the back of the yard. I have papers. I have signed agreements. I'd like to hear his accusation stated before every person in this yard, Marin said. Her voice carried, too. She'd learned that from her father, who'd had to make himself heard over frightened horses in open fields for 40 years. And then I'd like to answer it. In public. Right here. Voss smiled. He thought public shame was his weapon. He'd been using it on women for 20 years, and it had always worked. Go ahead, he said. Marin opened the ledger. She explained it the way her father had always explained a diagnosis. Start with what you can see, then show why it means what it means. She walked through how women were entered into Voss's records, not as passengers but as domestic freight expenses, listed under livestock shipping codes, so no one looking at a passenger manifest would know they'd traveled at all. Nell stepped forward and began reciting names. Destinations. The crowd donations. Because Nell Rusk had the particular quality of a woman who has been quiet for years and finally has something to say. And there is no sound more arresting than that. Tomas produced stage records. He showed 3 separate instances where a woman's name vanished from the legitimate passenger list and reappeared on a freight manifest under a different designation. Pearl identified her uncle's handwriting on 8 altered letters. including 2 that had been sent to Iron Spur Ranch over the previous year. Deke stood up in front of the crowd and said what he'd done plain, without softening it, and said he accepted what came after. Hester set a sealed tin on the auctioneer's table, opened it, and showed the preserved feed samples alongside the freight warehouse stamp from Voss's own supply company. Several men in the crowd had paid recruitment fees through Voss's bureau. 2 of them recognized the ledger entries beside their own names. Payments recorded against women who had never arrived at the addresses listed. Voss ordered his guards to open the remount pens. It was a last move, and he knew it. He needed confusion, needed people running and shouting, and the careful public record Marin had been building to collapse into noise and panic. The gates went open, and the horses came out. 40 animals, frightened and fast, and the crowd scattered. Marin was already moving. She caught the lead mare by the mane as she came through the gate, swung up bareback, and whistled the morning pattern, the low sequence that meant feed time and stillness, and everything is fine. The mare slowed, turned toward the sound. The herd began to follow her, the way herds do when the lead animal decides a direction, not all at once but in a wave, horse by horse, pulling away from the open road and back toward the familiar shape of corrals and fencing. Calder freed himself from Voss's guard in the confusion, took the man's gun hand at the wrist, and removed the pistol without particular ceremony. He organized the ranch hands to cover the exits from the pen yard, placing people where they needed to be, not with orders, but with quick words and trust that they'd move. Voss ran for the black stallion, still saddled from when he'd arrived, still tied to the far rail. Calder and Marin moved at the same moment, without speaking. The way people move when they've spent enough time reading each other to not need words anymore. She turned the lead mare toward the south gate. He signaled 2 hands to close the east gate. Deke, without being asked, walked calmly to the west gate and swung it shut. Voss rode into an empty loading pen with 3 closed gates and stopped. He raised the pistol he'd kept in his coat. He pointed it at Marin. Calder's hand came down on Voss's arm before the hammer fell, and the shot went into the dirt, and then Voss was on the ground and disarmed, and very still, because Calder was kneeling on his chest with a forearm across his throat and a look on his face that was colder than anything the weather had offered all winter. He stayed there a long moment. Then he stood up and stepped back. "You don't get to decide what kind of man I become," Calder said. The territorial officers who'd come for the remount auction took Ephraim Voss into custody in front of the entire crowd, using his own ledger as the first piece of evidence. His guards surrendered once the crowd understood. Voss had planned to leave them holding the blame if anything went wrong. Loyalty purchased with fear tends to end the moment the purchase price goes up. Before Marin could say anything, before she could cross the yard to where Calder stood, he walked to the auctioneer's table, picked up the fraudulent marriage contract that Voss's agent had filed at the start of this whole thing, and tore it in half in front of every person present. "You are free of me," he said, looking straight at her, "and every dollar I spent." Marin looked at the road leading out of Dry Creek, flat, south-running, open. Then she looked at the road that led back toward the mountains, toward Iron Spur. Spring came to the Sangre de Cristos, the way it always did, slow, and then sudden, one morning just cold, and the next morning something different in the light. The first healthy foal of the new season was born on a Tuesday, standing within the hour, all legs and suspicion about the world, and Marin was there for it the same way she'd been there for the difficult birth in winter, except this time there was no crisis, just the ordinary miracle of a new animal deciding to exist. She checked it over with practiced hands, running her fingers along the legs, checking the eyes, listening to the breathing, and wrote her notes in the ledger she kept for the infirmary, which had its own page now in the ranch's official records, separate from the horse breeding logs, separate from the shipping accounts. Hers. The disease suspension had been lifted in February, once the territorial laboratory confirmed what Marin had said from the beginning: poisoning not illness. The Army contract renewed in March. 3. Neighboring ranchers had brought animals to the Iron Spur Infirmary by April. Small things: a lame quarter horse, a foal with a respiratory infection, a mare that wouldn't settle to the saddle after an injury. Word traveled in ranch country, and the word on Marin Bellamy's work traveled well. Nell lived in Dry Creek now, in a room above the telegraph office, which she paid for herself with wages from the women's travel station she had started coordinating in January. She came to the ranch on Sundays and sat at Hester's table and talked about everything except the 6 years she'd lost, which was her right, and nobody pushed her on it. Occasionally, she talked about plans, new routes, safe houses, women who needed to move west voluntarily without debt hanging over the journey. Pearl worked at the telegraph office with Tomas, who had turned out to be the calmest person in 3 counties and an excellent person to have on your side when you needed to coordinate information quickly. She was still answering investigators' questions about her uncle's operation, which would take a long time. Because the operation had been large and patient, and she had been inside it a long time, but she answered every question, and nobody who knew her history doubted that cost her something. Deke was not the foreman anymore. He'd been clear-eyed about that from the beginning, clear-eyed about what he'd done and what it had cost, and he hadn't tried to bargain his way back to where he'd been. He worked the horses, kept his head down, did the job well. Some of the hands had forgiven him faster than others. That was the nature of trust. It didn't come back on a schedule. Hester had converted the old bunkhouse at the east end of the property into a clean, functional stopping place for women traveling west, 8 beds, a wood stove, a lockable door, and a sign above the entrance that said, "Travelers could stay 3 nights at no cost." It had not sat empty since February. On the afternoon, Calder offered Marin the partnership. They were standing in the pasture, watching the rebuilt herd move through the spring grass, the black stallion leading them with his neck arched like he'd forgotten there was ever a winter. "Equal authority over the horse operation," Calder said. "Your name on the deed as partner, not contingent on anything else between us." "I want to make sure my work and my choices stay separate," Marin said. "The partnership is the partnership. Whatever else we are or aren't is its own thing." Agreed. He reached into his coat and held out a piece of paper. "Folded once I had the property restructured last month. Your professional stake doesn't depend on marriage. Doesn't end without it. It's yours, because you built it." She took the paper and looked at it a long time. "That took planning," she said. "I had some help," he said. "Hester told me what to do, and I did it." Marin almost smiled. "At least you're listening to someone." "I'm trying to listen better generally." He looked out at the horses. "I know I'm not finished learning that. I probably won't be for a long time." "No," she agreed. "You probably won't." They stood there a while longer, the spring light changing on the mountains, the sound of the herd moving through grass that was finally coming back after the hard winter. "I'm not asking for a reward," Calder said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you on the basis of what I did or didn't do right, but I want to ask you anyway. Whether you want to build a life beside me." Marin was quiet a moment. "I'll tell you what I want," she said. "I want a spring engagement. I want a ceremony when we're ready and not before. And I want our vows to contain no language of obedience in any direction." "I would expect nothing less," he said. She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stage in a sleet storm with a cut handle on her trunk and no idea what was waiting for her, she felt something that wasn't caution, wasn't negotiation, wasn't the careful measuring of what she was owed and what she owed back. She felt like she was home. Later, inside the infirmary doorway, Marin paused and looked up at the pair of dark red reins hanging above the door. Both of them, together now, evidence decoded, pattern read, no longer hiding anything. She reached up and ran a finger along the braiding, the same stitch her father had taught her with patient hands on a cold morning more years ago than she wanted to count. You paid for a wife, she said, to no one in particular, to the morning, to the memory of how this had all started. Her voice was warm now, nothing like the anger that had first shaped those words. Not a servant. From behind her, Calder's voice. I paid for a journey that should never have been sold. The wife standing before me cannot be bought, and that is the only woman I would ever ask to stay. Out in the spring pasture, the black stallion led the herd through the open gate, and above the infirmary door, the old red reins hung still in the morning light, held by no one, guiding nothing, and meaning everything. There's something I want you to sit with before you go. Marin Bellamy crossed half a country on the strength of letters that turned out to be lies. She arrived soaking wet, publicly rejected, surrounded by men who assumed she owed them her labor because someone had paid her fare. And in that moment, tired, humiliated, with nowhere safe to go, she stood up anyway. Not because she was fearless, because she understood something that took Calder Rusk 6 years of guilt and loss to finally learn. You cannot purchase a person's worth. You cannot manufacture belonging through debt. And protection that comes with conditions attached is just control wearing a kinder face. That's the real story here. Not the poisoned horses, not the coated reins, not even the villain brought down in front of a crowded auction yard. Those are the bones of the plot. The heart of it is two people who had both been taught in different ways that love is a transaction. Marin believed she had to earn her place by being useful enough. Calder believed he could keep people safe by making their decisions for them. And both of those beliefs, held tightly and without examination, caused real damage to real people they cared about. What changed them wasn't a grand romantic gesture. It was smaller than that and harder. It was Calder saying I was wrong without asking to be forgiven in the same breath. It was Marin signing a professional partnership before she accepted a proposal, because she needed her future to belong to her regardless of what happened between them personally. It was both of them learning, slowly and imperfectly, that trusting another person's judgment is not weakness. It is the only foundation that actually holds. We live in a world that still sometimes confuses possession with love. That mistakes financial obligation for loyalty. That tells people, especially women, that safety is something given to you by someone stronger, and therefore something that can be taken away. This story pushes back against all of that, quietly but without apology. A home is not a place someone buys you. It is somewhere you choose to return to, freely knowing you could leave. Marin chose iron, spur, not because she owed it, not because she had nowhere else to go, because by the end, it was hers in every way that mattered, and the man, standing beside her, had finally learned the difference between holding on and holding open. That's the kind of love worth writing about, the kind worth waiting for, the kind that asks nothing of you except that you show up as yourself, honest and whole, and trust that to be enough. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever felt like you had to earn your place in a room, in a relationship, in a life, I hope Marin's voice stays with you a little longer than this video does. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental.